Today is Thursday, February 15th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. I'm here once again with my podcast co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's been a busy week. We're flying out tomorrow, hopefully the same day this podcast posts, to do some TWPs in Arkansas. Very much looking forward to it. Haven't been to Arkansas in a while. So, doing really well. Mr. Robinson, how are you?
Good. I think this is only your second TWP trip this year, right?
Yeah, I think so. For this year, 2024, yes.
It's, for those who may not know, as often as possible, we try to send telecast presenters to the TWPs because it's a name people know and hopes that it'll be more of a draw. And
hopefully it means more people come instead of realize, I don't want to go see that guy.
Okay, what is our topic today? And are we possibly going to crush anybody's dreams?
I hope we don't crush any dreams. Instead, I hope we lift people up to higher places. Today, we are going to tackle the soulmate myth. There was a great article in the New York Times yesterday for reasons we'll discuss afterwards, probably obvious to some on the calendar. And we're going to take a look at it and explain the biblical point of view, which just so happens to have been covered well, believe it or not, in a New York Times article.
Sounds great. Look forward to it.
All right. Welcome once again to the Living Youth Podcast. And the topic today, in terms of soulmates and that idea of, there's a whole model come to, as we'll see, about how you should look at your relationship in terms of the kind of future you one day want to marry. How do you see other people? You're looking for a soulmate. That model had an article written about it, and the title of the article kind of gives you a bit of a spoiler alert. The title of the article was "Don't Buy the Soulmate Myth." And that might sound like something Mr. Robinson and I would write, but we did not. It was actually written and published in the New York Times. I don't know that it was published yesterday. Yesterday on the calendar was a pagan holiday. As we record this, it was Valentine's Day, which we do not keep in the church because we are not a bunch of heathen. But I know there were so many stories leading up to that talking about romance, etc. But good old Brad Wilcox, he is an individual, a researcher for the IFS, was the Institute for Family Studies, if I recall, and he does great work. I enjoy his articles. I wouldn't be surprised if we've quoted some of his work on the program before. And he wrote an opinion piece that the New York Times published titled, "Don't Buy the Soulmate Myth." And it talks about what that is. It actually goes into real studies in terms of whether the idea that you have a soulmate or should be looking for a soulmate, what kind of family life that can lead to for you. And it just seemed like a topic we should discuss.
Now, you and I have formulated an opinion on this over time, and so as adults and men who've been married for, I think you're 30 years, and I'm close to it. But what did you think about? So we already have formed an opinion, a fact-based opinion in our opinion. But when you were younger, what did you think about it? So, for example, I heard that, and it's an attractive sounding idea. The idea that there really is, for us as men, that there's a female out there who is kind of the, your what's that? We were trying to think of movies that would portray this idea, and it made me think of Jerry Maguire.
Oh, that's right.
You complete me.
Yeah.
Now, I don't have a problem with that idea at all,
right? Because
that is a
God making
concept,
man
right?
and woman to be complementary. Sure.
But I fine, it's kind of a neat sounding thing. But then as I got older, I thought, well, maybe there's a really small pool of people that
right.
that are a good fit for you. But then in my early 20s, I really came to think, well, I don't know about that. I mean, I think if you're not selfish and you approach things from a Christian perspective, you should be able to make a good life with a high percentage of the opposite sex.
Mm-hmm.
But what were your thoughts growing up about the idea of the soulmate?
I appreciate your asking. I would say that probably when I was younger, my thoughts were shallow to non-existent, in the sense that I was just living life in the flow that the world has created. And the world the flow the world has created, and I didn't. We've mentioned this many times before, but I didn't start attending the church until I was 18. Didn't even start learning the truth until I was 14. And before that, I was a worldly guy. I mean, I like to think I was a good guy, quote unquote. But at the same time,
Texas, so.
but I was definitely into the philosophies, the ways of the world, and definitely was doing the boyfriend girlfriend thing. We'll talk about that. I was definitely into doing that. And with all of that, I was just kind of riding the wave. But the wave very much was, as one of the things I like about this article is Brad Wilcox takes the time to define a soulmate in terms of what are people saying, what does that really mean in terms of the soulmate model, if you will. And what he describes very much seems to fit, I guess, the way I was thinking about life. Because I've often talked about the soulmate being like this one person. There's this one person on the planet, right, that is your soulmate. Well, he actually, and I think very helpfully, broadens that a bit to not just the idea that there's one single special person, but that rather more the soulmate model, like that maybe more than one person would fit, but you're still acting on this kind of soulmate idea, this soulmate approach to finding that special someone. And in the article, he essentially explains, and I'll borrow his words, that what is a soulmate, quote unquote, from the way the article focuses on this. A soulmate is that special person who gives you an intense emotional and romantic connection, who makes you feel happy and fulfilled. Another fellow he quotes, and actually I'll just read from the article in this part. He quotes a psychologist. He writes, as psychologist Scott Stanley of the University of Denver writes, a soulmate is, quote, someone for whom you would not have to make major compromises.
Okay.
I thought that's a great way to put it. This idea that this person just fits so well with you that you don't even have to change much about yourself or your life because this person already matches so well. And he goes on to say, this is back to Brad Wilcox. He writes, your soulmate should be easy to love, someone who simply makes you feel happy.
Okay.
And I thought that's probably a pretty good definition of what we're talking about when we talk about soulmates. And so the article about this is about this idea of that should you be looking for a soulmate. And if you go back to the original thing I said, that a soulmate is that special person who gives you an intense emotional and romantic connection, who makes you feel happy and fulfilled. What are we about here on the podcast? We're about thinking biblically. And if we're about thinking biblically, there should be some alarms that go off at that definition, because notice the focus on yourself, the focus on you. It's someone who makes you feel happy and makes you fulfilled and who gives you an intense emotional and romantic connection. Like the fellow said later, someone for whom you will not have to make much compromise, and not really have to make much change. All of those should be red flags. They're the kind of things that should highlight for us that maybe this is not the best model to be used to narrow down a potential life partner with.
Yeah. And you rightfully note here in our show notes, it's a very popular idea in movies. Although I will say, feels like movies have changed over the last 5, maybe I wouldn't even go out 10 years. And there used to always be every year some handful of boy meets girl, kind of a traditional romance. Not a lot of those movies come out anymore.
Really?
In fact, you and I both admitted that we watch trailers sometimes, and I liked watching movie trailers because it kind of helped me keep up with what movies are coming out. And some of the trailers these days tell you the whole story anyway.
Yeah, they do.
And there's a real trend of, when I say horror, I mean as broadly as possible. Lots of movies are kind of dark or horror based or some kind of bad thing.
Yeah.
But there used to be tons of movies and books like this, and it's not, you and I are not against finding somebody who's a good natural fit with shared interests and everything. But if the idea is they're going to make life easy for you, 100%, that's a red flag right there, which we'll go into why that's a red flag.
No, absolutely. Brad Wilcox in the article talks a bit about this himself concerning what this model, this thinking sets you up for. He writes early on, He says, the problem with this model is that it offers a view of marital love that is hard to sustain, one focused on the ebb and flow of romantic feelings. Seeing marriage this way is attractive on its face, he writes, because romance is so charming. But as an ideal, it can make it more difficult for husbands and wives to embrace a richer, more stable, and ultimately more satisfying idea of marriage beyond the me first spirit of soulmate, I'd say quote unquote love. And I think that's part of what we will find, because one thing I like about this is they actually do some studies. They actually look at actual families and see that. And what he's highlighting is that's just not reality. I don't think I have a quote from the article about this, but he highlights, well, deep down, and by the way, we're not anti-romance. I should highlight that. If you look at Proverbs chapter 30, verses 18 and 19, there's this beautiful phrase that I love in the Proverbs. It's one of my favorite little Proverbs. But in Proverbs 30, 18 through 19, we read, there are 3 things which are too wonderful for me. Yes, 4 which I do not understand. The way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a virgin. And by that it means a young maiden, an unmarried woman. So it's not even talking about husband and wife yet. It's talking about that the chemistry between two people, and there's nothing wrong with chemistry, but that's part of what, in fact, you can look at the whole Song of Solomon. The whole Song of Solomon is very romantic in terms of the sentiment that is expressed. But what he's talking about here is this idea that these romantic feelings this person causes to well up within you, the idea that, it's just so easy to love this person. It's like we were made to just match. Look at us. There's so much that's alike here. And the idea that is the basis of building a marriage and recognizing this is a person that I need to, this is the person I should spend the rest of my life with. What it highlights is the fact that, when it comes to romance, believe it or not, there's a lot of chemistry involved. And they say these people have chemistry. There's literal chemistry, as in various things released in your bloodstream.
Biology. Yep.
Exactly. And that is very much like a drug. What is drugs? It's also chemistry. It flows in your body and it connects with your brain in different ways. It gets various hormones flowing. And one of the points he makes in the article is that because it is so chemical based, it doesn't last. That it's literally impossible for the same butterflies that are triggered in your stomach, if you will, when you have those romantic connections with someone, early in in the honeymoon period of your marriage. Those literally can't last forever. That's not the way drugs work, and that's not the way chemicals work. That is going to change. And yet for the soulmate model, in the end, even though it doesn't feel that way, no one thinks of their emotions, well, all this is chemical driven. They don't think that. They think, this is clearly a great relationship. This is something I should build my future on. And then eventually all those chemicals die away, and because they just don't have the same effect anymore, and you don't know how to deal with that afterwards because you haven't actually built that relationship on something more substantial.
Well, so the first thing I'd like to tackle, if you will, is the idea of that's something that's relatively, not even relative, something that's very meaningful to you, and that could be anything, is going to require very little effort.
Right.
I've watched lots of professional sports. You look at professional musicians, concert pianists, and even your own job. Like anything that's important to you, that's rewarding, will never be effortless.
Right.
You always have to. Yeah, it's been so fascinating to me to watch professional athletes, because lots of guys come into so when let's say you rise up through the ranks and you make it onto a professional sports team. Well, a lot of times when you're first up there, you've gotten by on talent. Like you just are younger, faster, quicker. You have lots of natural talent. But the guys that are successful and over time have to work on the basics. They have to constantly work on their game. They have to, when everybody's fast, then you need to have better technique. So that's just, you have to put a tremendous amount of effort into being a great professional athlete, even if you already came in with some natural talent. Our jobs, the profession you and I are in, it's enjoyable, and we like doing it, and we like coming to the office, and we like working with each other. And I mean, even our extended department here, it's not effortless,
Right.
you know. And so the idea that you could have something as one of the most significant components of your life being a spouse, and it, even the idea that you're going to go into it and it's going to be relatively effortless because you found your soulmate, is nobody does this intentionally, but it's like almost an insulting concept that that a marriage would be effortless because you found your soulmate.
Right. That's such a great way to put that, Mr. Robinson. Even these people, like let's say you finally get a job in what seems like a dream career. It's like, this is what I've always wanted to do, and now I get to do it for a living. Now, well, even when that happens, all the more is something you're going to have to dive into and work for if you're going to expect to be any good. You do know those high school players that, man, it's like they just had a gift. They were so much better than everybody else, and it just felt having the, I'm going to try to use some sports terminology for someone who doesn't.
This is going to be good.
Boy, the pig skin just feels natural in my hand because it used to be made of pig skin.
Yeah, it used to
probably
be.
still is. Okay,
Yeah, no, I think
that's a
it's
football,
synthetic
I'm
now.
assuming, right? Okay. But it's kind of like when I learned also in high school, I got really good grades, and oh boy, you're so smart. Then you go to college, and guess what? It's filled with everybody who got good grades. Next thing you know, it's like, well, you've really got to work to excel. And in other things, like things you really love, it's kind of a weird kind of Catholic-y analogy, but one of my old math professors had a good, there's times we're doing math in the classroom, and if we're thinking about doing a podcast in the future about math, and you might think math is about numbers, but when you're majoring in pure math, you're using very few numbers. It's a lot of work, but it's very few numbers.
Well,
and we got to a point in one class, I think it was topology, is my topology professor, and we actually had to do some number crunching, which you might think that's what mathematicians love doing. It's no, you actually do very little of that, but we had to do some. And he told us, he said, look, the next part isn't fun. We've got to crunch some numbers. But he says, you know what? Even the parish priest has to mow the parish lawn. That is, the parish priest did get into being a priest because he wanted to mow lawns, but guess what? That's part of the parish priest's job as well. And so this idea that, love is just effortless when you find the right person. No, nothing. Effortless means degradation, means falling apart. It means getting worse instead of better for the most part.
I had a friend. Now this goes back, let me think, more than 10 years ago, and it was so fascinating because he was an elite concert violinist. Like, he did do it professionally, but and so we would talk about it all the time. And he was a big believer in talent, and he likes the idea that he or others have this innate talent that other people don't have. Okay. And I'm not judging that one way or the other.
Right.
Because what was fascinating was he taught violin for quite a while, and he found that unfortunately the talented ones often didn't work hard. And the ones with less talent, but really practiced and applied themselves and learned how to play the violin, always ended up becoming the superior violinist. I shouldn't say, not always. I would argue so. There's a question like, how is Michael Jordan, the greatest basketball player of all time? Sorry, you LeBron fans out there. But he's such a unique, rare mix of, one, he had elite athleticism, okay? But a lot of people come into the league with elite athleticism,
right?
Okay, why aren't they Michael Jordan? That guy had a drive that you just cannot be accounted for. And so he's... And in perceived slights, he drove himself, with it's me against the world kind of idea, which I am not recommending. But the point was, if you take elite athleticism and elite effort, you get Michael Jordan. So I mean, there are times people who are uber talented, and when they apply themselves, they go where most people cannot go. But that overall, the maybe less naturally talented people who knew that it kind of benefited them to know that they were less talented in some ways. Oh, so-and-so over here is already so much better at playing. They worked harder and they practiced more.
I think, because I had this quote that I wanted to read from the article, and what you just said meshes really well with the end of the quote. The problem is it's kind of a long quote, but the first part of the quote actually highlights that it's not like Mr. Robinson and I are just saying this for no reason. So I'm going to read the whole thing, but please know how the end of it, I think chimes in with this. If not, we'll all agree that was a dumb conclusion on my part. And I'm a big boy, I can take it. But going back to the article, one of the reasons that we do think this is worthwhile talking, because we're talking to teens and young adults, and one we've already mentioned, the world is trying to sell you this idea. Every romantic movie, the soulmate model is what drives entertainment when it comes to depicting relationships and romance. But the stats bear this out as well, in terms of that young people are clearly influenced by this or think this way, because in his article, Brad Wilcox writes the following. This idea has proved especially popular among young adults in the U.S. A 2011 Marist poll found that 73% of Americans believed in a soulmate, the idea that, quote, two people are destined to be together, with fully 80% of those under 30 taking this view. For those seeking a soulmate, what matters is emotional skills and the ability to spark romantic or sexual chemistry. These qualities are supposed to put men and women on the path to what they see as the primary goods of marriage: intimacy, self-expression, and self-fulfillment. Now, let me pause there. That 100%, that is what I see being sold, not just in movies, but even in self-help shows, etc.
Okay.
Is your marriage, are you able to express yourself? Marriage should be a vehicle for your self-fulfillment and such.
Okay.
It's just fascinating.
Well,
to
I was
me.
going to ask you to recast that in other words, what you said, but you just did.
Oh, did I? Okay, well, great. We have a psychic bond.
Because listen,
Maybe we're soulmates, Mr. Robinson.
this might also be because it's the end of the day, which is not always my strongest suit. But I even read when you read through that, and I'm reading along with you. I'm like, what does that even mean? What's it trying to say here? No, you explained this. I appreciate.
Yeah,
that.
the primary thing of marriage should be making you. You should be about marriage. Should lift me up. You know, I mean, I should be.
That's my other red flag.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me get to the part that actually I thought relates to Michael Jordan, sort of. The problem, of course, he continues, is that very few couples can maintain this romantic high. No one person, no one relationship can give us great pleasure and great happiness all or even most of the time. Couples who embrace the soulmate model are often left disappointed by the real world realities of love and marriage. As Stanley writes, the psychologist he mentioned earlier, soulmatism conveys an expectation of heavenly connection that makes earthbound relationships more difficult. Now, here what I thought about Michael Jordan, because I am not a sports guy. We've said that many times on the program. I'm not as sportsy. I think Tyler Wayne coined the word sportsy. I'm not sure. Maybe that was Ben Graham. But I'm not that sportsy. But man, I love watching clips of Michael Jordan play. I mean, it's like you're watching a human magician, but it's not sorcery or magic. However, part of what guys like to do is they make it look easy. They just make it look like this is fun. Like this person, you wouldn't just look at that and it's not obvious how much work is going into that, how much of that. All you tend to talk about is, oh, this uniquely talented person. And this idea that relationships should be the same way, that if you find the right person, man, it just doesn't take all that much work. It doesn't take. But in reality, the great relationships out there are those that are being heavily invested in. Not just invested in because, oh, the love compels me, but because that marriage means something to them. And so they are investing in that marriage.
Now, this could be misconstrued as me being critical of this, but so you watch something like Cinderella, any of those kind of like the prince, prince rescuing the prince, and the prince ends up with the princess, and they get married, and her foot fits the glass slipper, she's marrying the prince, the whole deal, and it ends, and it was always like the happily ever after. And as I got older, okay, and I don't think of myself as a cynical person, so like you could say as I got old and cynical. No, I like to think it's old in reality. Mm-hmm. So, it's like they lived happily ever after, and, the credits are rolling and it gets dark, and I'm like, well, now real life begins. And I would like to check in on them 5 to 10 years later. How's it going?
It was such a different ending. It's like, and then real life began. That would be a much more realistic ending. That's hilarious. Okay, so to move on eventually to the alternative, I thought we could talk a little bit about any experiences that we're familiar with. What do you have in mind?
Well, okay, we may cover this later, but one of the things that came out when you were reading that earlier was sort of this mentality of this other person they're perfect for me. Like they fulfill all my needs.
Oh,
and so
right.
that's one of my it's not a pet peeve, but it's one of the things I've really had to learn. Like I did the same thing when I was young and looking for a wife.
That's what we're trying to do is help you overcome such
Right.
instinctive drives.
You correct me if you don't agree with this, but I think this is a very common mindset that we come into is like I've got to find my spouse. Okay, it doesn't matter if you're male or female, and you're trying to round out your life, and you're thinking about how this person will fit into your life, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. But there's a flip side of that, and you got to figure out how you fit into their life as well. And in my opinion,
Right.
this idea of a soulmate kind of leaves out the idea of how you're benefiting the other person. I mean, clearly your amazing charm and the fact that they fit you so perfectly is going to benefit them. But like, I know we've said it before, and we'll not apologize for saying it again, but like a true successful fulfilling marriage is work, and there's no way around it. And you've got, even if it's like an easier job, like let's say you do marry somebody who really has a real natural fit with you, and you have share so many things in common, and just so many things you like to do are shared. That is great, but you're still going to encounter sections of your life where you just have to navigate the bonds, and things change as time goes on. Like you said, those biological feelings fade away, and eventually you're left with real life and charting a life with somebody new. And then as kids enter into it, you're just constantly leveling up as you get married.
Oh, absolutely. And for my sake, in terms of my life before church and before I learned any better, like I said earlier, I was very much caught up in that kind of thinking. It really was more, man, you just nailed it, Mr. Robinson, that the world tries to tell you to try to find someone that can fit into your life, but not encouraging you to find out that to meditate on how would I fit into that person's life? What am I capable of truly making this person happy? Am I capable of making the sacrifices I would need to make this person happy? Because I can't just be focused on my happiness. And I like the focus that Brad Wilcox brings later in the article when it comes to happiness. All the more, it actually reminds me of something that I remember hearing Mr. Hernandez say. I'll try to remember to mention he was the one that said it in a Charlotte Family Weekend seminar when I get there. But I do want to highlight, at least in terms of my personal experience, growing up very boyfriend-girlfriend oriented, that really was that mindset. Why do you end up narrowing down and being exclusive with a boyfriend or girlfriend as a teenager? Well, it's because of how they make you feel, and they like you, and that makes you feel great, and you feel really validated, and you feel good about yourself. But really, in the end, what I was practicing, because those weren't marriages, those were essentially like pretend marriages. You're pretending about this exclusive relationship, which is like a tiny baby picture of marriage. And so you're kind of pretending, oh, we're just exclusive. We're not. Well, one, you're robbing yourself of the ability to actually take anybody else out and get to learn more about yourself and who else you might actually be interested in being with one day.
Opportunity cost.
Yeah, let alone just plain making friends. Hopefully we'll talk about dating. And do we talk about dating recently, or is that something I can't remember? We've talked about so many different topics. I can't remember if we've done a podcast. I would like to talk about dating in terms of thinking of it as the church always tries to say, an opportunity to serve somebody else and show them a good time, and not trying to take romance out of it a bit, because why have all that unnecessary pressure?
Well, that helps with nervousness as well.
Yeah, 100%.
When you date, your focus is trying to help them have a good date. Then you're not so conscious of yourself, so nervous.
That's right. And yet with the whole boyfriend-girlfriend model, sure, you buy them flowers, you do things to try to make them happy, but in the end, why? Because they're making you so happy, right? But those don't last. And what did I end up practicing, frankly, as a young person with that model? I practiced divorce, really. Thankfully, I'm not divorced. Just so know my wife and I should get it right. This year, it'll be 32 years. But that's really what I was practicing, forming these relationships, and then eventually the person just makes you unhappy to the point that you end it and you find somebody else. And, forget all the temptations that are attendant with that sort of thing, and the social misdevelopment as you're not developing the skills to actually talk to people of the other sex and all sorts of kinds of relationships. It was just 100% unhealthy. And I remember as an adult in the church about, let's see, Michael had just been born and he will turn 20. Oh, I should definitely get this right. 25 this year, later this year. So we're talking about almost 25 years ago at the feast. It's the first time I ever heard Mr. Weston speak in person. He had recorded sermons and different things, but it was the first time I actually heard him speak in person.
I think I may have never heard Mr. Weston speak until he came to Charlotte.
Really? That's something I had to remember when he became presiding evangelist, is that a lot of people hadn't necessarily had the chance to. And
he was always he was stationed. When you're in the ministry, you're stationed. He was stationed in areas where just were nowhere near where we lived.
Well, in this case, because we were going to the feast in Missouri, an opening night message, Mr. Weston gave some advice to the young people, which was don't let your hormones cause you to make some foolish decisions this feast in terms of pairing off for the feast and not trying to meet, a lot of, you can always get a name and number and you can keep talking to somebody. But anyway, he gave a lot of advice, which I don't need to repeat because it's the same advice that he and the church continues to give today. But I remember sitting there thinking that, man, I wish I could take this nice man on stage, teleport him back in time to talk to me as a teenager and give me all of that advice, because my teenage years were built on ignoring that advice and following where the chemicals flowing in your vein pointed you, and that was it. And I regretted every bit of it.
I could go back in time and talk to my younger self and I would still not convince. I don't mean of this specifically, just, man, when I was 18, I was pretty sure none of those things that I was always warned about would happen to me. Like, there's something
really,
that I could work it out, navigate it. So I do have a question, though.
Okay. And by the way, we're hoping our audience is smarter than young Mr. Robinson, and will avoid those things.
I knew I'd grown up a little bit. This is actually a true story. I think I was about 23, and it does. I found out later it probably correlated with when the brain doesn't fully mature until your early to mid 20s. It just depends, and so. I feel like I can actually tell that I was 23 when that happened, because it just hit me. I was like, you know what? I could go through life observing other people's example and sidestepping trouble and not have to figure out every single thing on my own. It was like a breakthrough.
Like a realization.
It was true.
That's so funny.
It really happened. Okay, here's my question.
All right.
So they've studied this whole thing. Okay. So let's say you believe in soulmates and you actually find one, and they fit that definition we had earlier, and they make your life easier. How do those turn out compared to a regular marriage?
Okay, now that's a great question, because they do talk about this. And we're not, and I should preface it. We're not necessarily saying that it's impossible to find someone. I mean, you find people that make you feel that way. It's like, oh wow, this is great. It doesn't mean, oh, I should never ever marry this person one day. We're not talking about that. We're talking about making your decisions based on that, and seeing marriage as a vehicle of that, and trying to think about these relationships in the future. And yeah, Brad Wilcox addresses exactly what you just asked. And frankly, before I get there, I'll just preface that by saying, in the end, what he's going to find is that model stinks versus what I will call the church's model, what they call a family first model, that model actually is far more likely to produce satisfaction and happiness in marriage. Let me read this passage, and I believe it answers your question. So in the same article, Brad Wilcox is talking about this survey that was done in California. And he says, men and women who buy into the soulmate model appear more likely to end up divorced. This was apparent in the 2019 California Family Survey conducted by YouGov for the Institute for Family Studies, he's a part of that. He says, which asked 918 husbands and wives aged 18 to 50 to describe their approach to marriage and family life. They had to pick whether they saw marriage through the soulmate lens as, quote, mostly about an intense emotional romantic connection, or through the lens of family, that is, viewing marriage as, quote, about romance, but also about kids, money, and raising a family together. He said the survey found that husbands and wives who took the soulmate view were markedly more likely to report doubts about the future of their marriage compared to those who took a family-first view, even after controlling for factors like education, race, gender, and the presence of children. Likewise, that means, by the way, controlling for those things means even if they didn't have children not yet, if they were still thinking ahead, thinking, okay, what are we going to do with children? We're going to have children one day. What are we going to do? That even if they didn't have children yet, that didn't change the impact.
Okay.
He says, likewise, in the 2022 State of Our Unions survey, a poll, he says, I oversaw of 2,000 husbands and wives aged 18 to 55 across the U.S., we found that after controlling for the usual demographic factors, those who followed the Soulmate model were about twice as likely to report that they were divorcing or likely to divorce soon.
Wow.
Compared to those who followed the family first model. Yeah,
Interesting.
that's an intense difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's part of their point. It's not that, again, it's not that they're anti-romance. And even if you look at the family first model, that model recognizes that, well, romance, is an element of things. And he does say, I think elsewhere in the article, that I don't think I copied this part to quote, but that families who, like couples who amidst all their busyness, they try to set aside date nights, like my wife and I actually have a date night once a week. I try to, sometimes it means stopping at a fast food place and going to Target to buy some clothes. However, we do set aside.
That's just real life.
It is a real life date night, but we do try to set aside, a date night. And so, especially now we have, we don't have kids we've got to feed anymore. They can feed themselves and take care of themselves. They're adults. But yeah, we try to make sure there's just one night we'll go to, I don't want to advertise anyone's business, but Five Guys, or we go to City Barbecue.
Mm-hmm.
We've done that, but it's something like that. And anyway, they say that does make a difference. However, it's a matter of your worldview and how you see what marriage is supposed to be. Is it all about finding that person that has the butterflies and that should be the person that satisfies you the rest of your life, or is it about recognizing that no, you can't be the center of your concerns. The concerns have to exceed you to be about the larger thing, and where you're actually in second place to these larger concerns. And those couples that can figure that out, by far, they seem to be more likely to be successful.
I if you set aside the Soulmate model,
mm-hmm.
which really, the more I think about it, is a model that just makes your view of the future unrealistic, because you can still have like 98% of this experience, because you can still meet that special someone. You do get those feelings of love and all the biology that makes you feel so wonderful. Just be realistic and know that doesn't last forever.
Right.
And know that your marriage is going to require work. And we've talked about marriage quite a bit, so maybe we've gone into it a little bit, but it'd be interesting to go like, well, what do we mean by work? Maybe sometime we could talk about that.
Oh yeah, that might be interesting.
The other thing I want to finish that thought, because like we could sound kind of like old, crotchety old Ben who just that love's not gonna last forever. You need to be realistic.
You know what? You gotta find somebody that deep down you just hate intensely.
That's right.
In fact,
see if you can turn them.
If you can't stand being around them, that's who you ought to marry.
That's right.
We're not saying that.
No, not at all. Not at all. The journey is fun. It's rewarding. I was excited to get to call my wife my fiance when we got engaged. I always thought that was the coolest thing. I wanted to be able to say I had a fiance, and all of it. But the most if you go around and talk to older people in the church that have been around for a while, and you feel like they have a pretty good marriage, and they'll go talk to them, and they'll talk to you
Absolutely.
about the effort that you have to put in, and you know what, that's a good thing. Like it's something that keeps you challenged, keeps you on your toes. It's your most important relationship. And I'm not talking about your relationship with God. I just meant
among humans.
Among humans. You'll bring the kids will come into play and all these kinds of things. It's just always a work in progress, but it's very manageable.
And those, the people in your congregation, those older couples that have been married 30, 40, 50 years, they are like an untapped resource. And I wish I could encourage more to take advantage of that. Talk to people in your congregation. That's why talk to your parents, of course, but talk to the people in the congregation. We should be building on each other. Okay, so those things said, because we're not going to go too long today. We do want to be able to wrap it up. I thought what was interesting, because we teach this in the church. We're not going to go to a whole bunch of verses to talk about the fact that we teach this. We do teach that Mr. Wesson is actually very big about trying to encourage all of us to have the larger view of marriage, which is God's own view, which is not just, man, I love you and you love me, and that's all that really matters. It is not all that really matters. You need to think about what kind of family you would build. What do you want for children, right? How are they going to be impacted by your choices? How are frankly, your current family is going to be impacted by your choices. There's this larger picture that God has that I think resonates so well with what they talk about in this article of family first. And another thing I like about what Brad Wilcox has done is he talks about how that kind of thinking, why does it make for better marriages? And does it truly lead to more satisfaction? He gives at least two reasons. One of the things he mentions that we've already talked about is that feelings change. Biologically, the chemicals just don't work the same way after a while. And so to have the feelings you give each other be so vital and central to that choice that I'm going to marry this person, then it's kind of like, I'm going to marry this person because of the way they look.
Yeah.
Well, it doesn't mean they're not attractive. That you don't have to go find someone you don't find attractive. But let me just say on my own personal case, my looks have changed a little bit since I was 22, maybe a lot more than a little bit. And so, yeah, those things change. For one thing, it's literally like a drug that wears off. However, I thought the second thing was fundamental, and the second thing is what I've heard Mr. Hernandez say.
Well, let me support you on that. I did not know this. One of my books that I think it's the book called Hooked, and it talks about the biology that's going on underneath, and there's so much more biology going on than I realized. And so, for example, what's the difference between infatuation and love? And they've studied it biologically, and for 6 weeks, that nobody can tell the difference, even on a biological level. That you cannot, a biologist cannot tell the difference between. Okay, if they were able to do a body scan and read your
that is so interesting.
You couldn't tell, because
that even
the same.
Things that end up being significant relationships versus not, or I say significant more than infatuation, at least, that chemically, biologically, they just look so similar. If you are a young person, you just understand how untrustworthy those feelings are and untrustworthy those chemicals are. It's not that they're not a factor, but they're not the factor. And that's part of what they're discovering in the study. The second thing is, and I thought this was interesting, this really meshed well, I thought, with, in particular, what Mr. Hernandez, I heard him say at a Charlotte Family Weekend seminar, where we had seminars for singles, and they have older singles, younger singles. And he and I say teamed up. I did one, then he did one. But he made this point, and he makes exactly the same point in this article. So going back to the article, Brad Wilcox writes the following. He says, the second, more subtle psychological truth is that the soulmate model fails to see that happiness in life and in love is less likely to be found when we pursue it directly.
That's true.
Pursuing your own happiness is like chasing a mirage of water across a desert. Happiness is more likely to appear when we set our compass on destinations beyond ourselves and our desires. I thought that was so well put. He jumps and says, when it comes to marriage, those who seek not so much to feel good as to do good by loving their spouse and family members in various ways are actually more likely to end up happy in their marriages. That is, they've looked at these people, and those who focus on trying to feel good and be happy end up, ironically, not being as happy as those who focus on loving their spouse and their family members. And then he gives kind of some examples here at the end. He says the husband and father who sets aside his work, smartphone, and ESPN in the evenings to help with homework, shoot hoops, and tuck the kids in bed will likely take greater satisfaction from his family life than if he had pursued his own pleasures of the moment. And he will likely elicit more admiration, affection, and ardor from his wife as a natural response. Family first, me second. This is the paradoxical route to happiness in marriage.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful. Honestly, I feel like it's like, oh, he's covering is old news. But you know what? He's not. There's a reason he's publishing this because it's not what the world teaches. But it feels old news to me because I've been blessed to be in the church now for a few decades and to hear this kind of message preached. And you know what's interesting? When I was listening to Mr. Weston at the feast that time, and I talk about, oh, I wish I could just teleport this guy back to teenage me. Actually, that's not what I was thinking as much at the time. What I was thinking is I was looking around that huge feast side, well, huge, at the time, but there, like at the Ozarks, and thinking, man, this room is filled with some second generation Christians I know and kids and third generation Christians. And I know what I was like at that age, and I hope they're listening to this guy because he is really nailing it. And it's these kind of thoughts. They did find a California Family Church Survey found that husbands and wives who did this, they focused on family first, not their own happiness, but focused on serving others in the family. They were 58% more likely to be satisfied with their marriages compared to husbands and wives who tended to believe the soulmate model was the focus of marriage. And I thought, yeah, there's some solid statistics. It's nice to see.
Well, it's like Mr. Armstrong said decades ago. His excellent definition of love, it's outflowing concern. By love, by its own very nature, has to be directed towards other people. Get myself into trouble here with this description of it, but I mean, it really is. If you want to be loved, you need to yourself be part of relationships where you're taking care of the other people and making them feel loved. I've heard this so many times recently on some of the podcasts I listen to, some of the ones we've even mentioned before. Like, happiness is a result. Like, you can't pursue happiness. It's only attained through practicing certain principles, and then as a result, you are happy. Putting in an effort to be a good husband, putting in an effort to be a good father, seeing your wife and your children succeed in things they're doing, that is what makes you happy. And that is a result of the effort that you put in.
Exactly. And that's what Mr. I wish I could find quotes where he said it. This is exactly what Mr. Hernandez was trying to help people see in that message that I heard him give. He said that ironically, the more you chase happiness in terms of I want to be happy, the more you will find that it flees from you because it's always a product of something better, of a larger purpose, a larger pursuit.
So it's sort of like the more you tighten your grip, the more star systems will slip through your fingers.
Wow. What are you, a nerd? You sound like a nerd. He wraps it up. I don't know if he wrapped up his whole article this way, but it's the last quote that I had from him. And I feel like he actually summarizes exactly what you're saying, Mr. Robinson. Brad Wilcox wrote in this article, and we'll try to add a link. We do add links to things outside of what we have in the church, and the whole article is actually really worth reading. And it's good New York Times. The New York Times does not always publish good things, and I don't know if they even like this opinion piece, but they definitely published it. He writes this: the paradox of contemporary marital happiness is that husbands and wives who don't focus on being in love, but instead recognize that love is a decision to care for their spouse, kids, and kin, are more likely to find themselves happily married.
Well, nice. I didn't even read ahead on that.
You didn't? Yeah, and you were nailing it right there.
One of the things that really surprised me with this research, it's neat that somebody actually studied the whole the soulmate idea.
Right.
Well, to me, if there's the idea of a soulmate, somebody who fits you so well that you meet them and it's like you've always known them, and they just, I still can't let go of this idea that a relationship with them is easy.
Right.
Okay? Well, if you've met your soulmate, like you're set for life, right? Like that should be your person. But what happens if you find an even more soulmate?
Yes, right.
Is that a thing?
Yeah. Oh, it is a thing. I've seen it. If you live long enough, workplaces tend to be the place where that happens.
Yeah.
And regrettably, it becomes easy to do that there because, at home, the person you're building a life with, that's a lot of work and a lot of struggle, and there's bad times and good times, of course, but there's challenges versus say, and I'm not even talking about in the church. I'm talking about just my experience actually in a workplace, even, I'm not talking about anything in the church. I'm talking about something else. But individuals I've seen where this other person at work, well, there's not those challenges, they weren't late with dinner because you're not even having meals together or something, right? But as they talk with you, I've seen this happen where the person at work seems like more of a soulmate. I mean, boy, your wife hates the movies that you watch, but this person loves exactly the same kind of movies, and you can talk for hours, and it's wonderful. And I've seen couples where next thing you know, they've divorced the person that they were married to, they were actually building a life with, and they've found their new soulmate. Yeah, you're right. If there's a soulmate out there, it should be a little harder to upgrade than that. And that is exactly what you do see out there in the world. Honestly, I don't want to name them because they're famous people, and I should be able to name them. But let's say there was one kind of, and maybe I could be getting the details wrong, so all the more I don't want to name them. But it was a kind of high-profile Christian, quote-unquote, music performer who ended up leaving one spouse and then marrying somebody else. And all the explanations I remember reading in the paper, I don't think they used the word soulmate, though perhaps they did. But honestly, it was that kind of talk. It was that kind of talk, like, this person is, kind of a better match, so to speak. And yeah, that's what the soulmate thing sets you up for, because it's all based on who really seems to make you feel better. Eventually you come across someone that seems to make you feel better.
I mean, in some ways I think this is obvious, but at the same time I'm still struck by what an utterly selfish viewpoint that is.
It is.
Well, anyway, I won't go on about it.
The church, the world sells it really well, right? Because romance is great. It feels wonderful. But there's so much that's part of what we do in premarital counseling, is to try to help people see past the feelings of romance to make sure there's not, because there's important reality behind it, and to make sure they can see that with clear eyes, because romance tends to hide flaws and hide cracks. Maybe we can wrap up by highlighting this. All of you teens out there, you young adults, the world is working very hard to sell you on an idea. And it's not just the romance movies and stuff like we said, but even the self-help things, the messages from deep and profound thinkers, supposed thinkers, whether the Oprah Winfreys or whoever, the influencers, that, you've got to take care of you. You've really got to focus on yourself. And the whole soulmate myth is a part of that kind of thing, finding that person who is easy to love and who you'll never have to make it seems as though you'll never have to make any big changes for. But getting caught up in the world's soulmate idea as the means for understanding and choosing a person to marry is a disaster waiting to happen. The Bible, on the other hand, has a family-first kind of model. When you look at the whole, when you look at what it's emphasizing and what we teach in the church, a family-first model in which you focus on the larger picture, serving the other person, serving the family that you're building together, serving your extended family together, focusing on the other person's needs. Those things don't put happiness in the center of their concerns, at least not yours, and that's the wonderful contradiction. Is in the end, that approach, this family-first approach, really is a far surer path to happiness and contentment.
Yep. To me, if I had to summarize it, we've kind of said this off and on the whole podcast. Really, the idea of a soulmate is the idea of easy street, that you would have a deep, intimate relationship that's just easy, and it helps that I've had so much experience at this point, not compared to people who've been married 50 years, of course, but, once you get over 20 years, you've been married for a while and, you've learned some lessons. And a person, even if that kind of worked, even if the idea of a soulmate kind of worked and you had this easy relationship and, getting to know somebody who's different from you and forging a life with them and forging memories with them and getting over yourself and finding out what makes them happy, and that tension that's naturally inherent in a marriage, that actually makes you better and makes them better, there's something kind of fantastic about that.